Good evening, Dale again, Freedom's Call. Back with another video for you. This one hopefully will be a wee bit shorter than the last one that you got. But I did want to really move on with some of the other columns that are in the second N.Z.E.F role, the second part of the spreadsheet, so to speak. And today would especially like to focus on the birth dates and death dates that are to be found in those two columns. So it's not going to be quite as long, this video, as the last one that you saw, which may be as well, because I don't want to put you to sleep. But I think it's important that we do look at them, look at those two columns, because there's a little more to a date of birth or a date of death than the eye first sees. So I will get on to talking about those two columns. First off, though, I want to draw your attention to the upper part of the spreadsheet. Now, I haven't touched on these, what I call keys, before, but they give you they're essentially aids to understanding what it is that you're actually looking at in certain of the columns that are to be found in that main role. When I refer to the main role, I'm talking here about the second N.Z.E.F role. So we'll look at that, and then we may do just a very, very quick wrap-up by going to the website itself, the Freedom's Call website, and pulling up the menu that relates to birth and death records and some of the sub-menus there, and just I'll just cover a couple of other things that maybe haven't been brought out as we take a look at this roll of honour. So with that said, I'm now going to pull that up, and I'm going to explain what some of the significance of some of these entries for you. Okay. First of all, let's get up to those keys that I've been talking about. Now, if you go right to the very top of the spreadsheet, you will see, this is left-hand side now, right to the very top, you will see a color-coded, a box of striped cells of different colors, and then within each are the various embarkation roles, or nominal roles, and that just helps you identify some of those roles when you're looking across at the embarkation dates column, which is column N. So I don't think I need to go into that in too much more detail, but as you see, the first embarkation was in March 40, the second embarkation to June 40, so we're talking April to June 40, the third from July 40 to March 41, the fourth from April 41 to June 41, the fifth from July 41 to September 41. So you would have been seeing around about this time conscription coming into play here, where you know, no longer were we looking at just voluntary enlistment. I think it was 1941 that conscription came into being. So 6th roll, October to December 41. 7th roll, which is January to March 42. The 8th roll was a big roll, April 42 to June 42, as was one of those, I think, the April to June 41 roll. So then after that we have July 42 to December 42, another, as I said, yeah, that's a big roll. January 43 to March 43, April 43 to June 43, July 43 to December 43, January 44 to March 44, April 44 to December 44, January 45 to December 45, another very big roll, and then finally January 46 to June 48, which is when J-Force embarked. So in all, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 nominal rolls. And we can maybe, when we take a little look later on, not in this video, but when we do return to the website at some other time, we may just speak a little bit more about these particular roles. Immediately to the right of that, you'll see a key, and I'm going to go through that very quickly with you. POW simply means prisoner of war. I think pretty self-explanatory. N.Z.E.F, that means that this nurse is to be found on the N.Z.E.F roll. Now, there were some women who did serve with the N.Z.E.F and the WAAC who are not on the rolls to be found on the military nursing site, the New Zealand military nursing site. But if they are on the rolls which are on that site, then that is duly noted in this column. So that's N.Z.E.F. Likewise, the same for the women soldiers who serve with the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps here in New Zealand. Now, don't confuse that with the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps in the UK or in any other country. I'm talking about New Zealand. Those who serve with the, obviously, with the second N.Z.E.F, which is a New Zealand division. C, column A, shows whether that person features on the Auckland Museum Cenotaph database, and in this case virtually everybody does. MB, whether they served with the Maori Battalion, whether they embarked with them or whether they subsequently were transferred over to the 28 Maori Battalion, and MB roles, whether they're on the Maori Battalion roll. And if we look at the Maori Battalion roles, a Y, as I think I mentioned in an earlier video, Y indicates yes, they're on the main roll, and if you see the words 15th or J-Force, that simply means that they serve with the 15th Reinforcements or with J-Force. Now we're going to go right across, still right at the top of the page, but right across to the other side now under column AD, and I want to quickly touch on the key that you see there and the abbreviations. BI, whether that person is on the birth, deaths and marriages birth index, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. DI, whether they're on the birth, deaths and marriages, death index. FAG, if they have a profile up on the Find a Grave website, which is an international site where people can submit photos of graves of loved ones. Photo simply, in the next column, shows if there is a photo up on that site, as opposed to only a profile. BG, whether a photo exists up on the Billion Graves website. Now, they usually don't have a profile, and normally you're just looking at a photo of a gravestone or a photograph of something up on that site. And FMS is a new column that's just been recently added in, and it's, if you see an asterisk in that particular column, that shows if another family member has served, whether with this particular role, with the other forces role, or with or perhaps they don't even feature on one of what I term my roles here. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the birth and death indices. Now, so we're looking here at columns X and Y of the spreadsheet. And first off, I'd like to make the point that it is possible to undertake a search of a person's birth and death. And one does that through the New Zealand Birth, Deaths and Marriages Index website. Now, I will provide links to this at the foot of this video, which is going to be placed up on YouTube, but it will also be accessible via the Facebook page, the Freedom's Call Facebook page. Now, so as at today, which is the 9th of May 1920, I can undertake a search of anyone born before today's date and including today's date. So we're talking then the 9th of May 1920. Up until that date, no problem. Tomorrow I can look at the 10th of May 1920. If I conduct such a search and I find that person appears on the birth index, then great. you will see that I have highlighted or blanked out that particular entry in both the birth and death columns. I have a light blue background in there. That shows that I've undertaken the search, and as a result of that, I've also been able to establish the parents' names, which is shown over in the details column, which is column AK. Now, of course, many people, you will not always find somebody in the birth index when you do your search of the birth index, and there can be various reasons for that. If it was many of the Maori soldiers, I would just make this point, that many of the Maori soldiers don't feature on the birth index, or at least they haven't in my searches. Now, that may be because the birth was registered under a different name. They're a variation of the Maori name. It may mean that, the birth was registered in a European name, when commonly now they use the Maori name, or vice versa. They commonly now use the European name, and the birth was registered in a Maori name. But I think many simply were not registered because they just don't feature there, and that could be perhaps because their families lived in remote areas. I understand, somebody told me that there is actually a Maori birth index in existence somewhere, but I certainly have never found it. And of course, if that person was born overseas, then you're not going to find them there anyway. Now, it's not only Maori who don't feature there. Sometimes also you're not going to find the odd European, for whatever reason, I don't know. From other sources, I'm told say that they were born in Wairua, but I can't find them on the birth index. Now, that's not to say they're not there, and I would encourage anybody to go back. If I've come up with a blank, then do go back and check yourself, because you may be privy to information that I don't have that's going to enable you to zero in on the birth details for that particular soldier or nurse. If the checks are yet to be done, and I normally carry out these checks every fortnight, so twice a month, basically what I do is I go through the roll. I've color-coded a month or two ahead, just for my purposes, and so I will look at that particular color-coded entry, all births that have elapsed, say from the 1st of the month through to the 15th of the month, run a check, and then hopefully I'm able to blue those out. If I've been unable to find a person in the birth index, then I note that fact over in the, if you go right across to column AE under BI, you'll just see an N there. That simply means I wasn't able to find that person there. So anything with a white background, yep, really I'm going to need to look at that at some time in the future. The youngest of these servicemen, by the way, was born in about 1930. Would have gone away with J-Force, so hopefully I'll be around then to keep continuing with my checks. Sometimes you'll see the notation C note, which means I've got to go and check something out in the future. And sometimes you'll see an entry which has an older date in it. I'm looking at one now, 27th of September 1899. It's highlighted in pink. And for whatever reason, I need to return and have another look at that at some point. You'll also sometimes see simply a letter of the alphabet in a cell. There's one here that's got the letter F in it that I'm looking at, and that's just for my purposes. You don't need to concern yourself with that, but that tells me that I need to go back and do a check of the birth index around about 2021, 22, somewhere around about there. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into entries in the birth index. The death index, I have not been quite as pedantic. Most of the entries there you will find appear in the death index, not all. And again, that can be for a variety of reasons too. Sometimes there just doesn't appear to be a reason, but it could be because of name differences. Obviously, if the person died overseas, they're not going to feature on the death index, even though you may have had a situation where the body or the ashes were returned to New Zealand for interment here. So, you know, as you will find out when we get to cemetery, start looking at the cemetery column, we're able to explain that in a little bit more detail for you. So anything that you see in with a pink background there is something that I'm really going to be looking at further. It's going to be looked at in conjunction with the birth index at some future time. Likewise, if you see the notation, see note. If you see any entries at all that have just got dashes, that would indicate that that person, I've given up on, to be honest, but perhaps a very, very common name like, John Smith. You'd never ever be able to zero in probably on that particular John Smith to confirm his date of birth and or death. If you see any entry that has a yellow background, and there are a good number sprinkled throughout this column, these are those chaps that who appear on the lest we forget roll that I spoke about in an earlier video. And this simply shows that they either died on active service overseas, or they died in New Zealand, but that was upon their return from active service overseas and before war's end, or at least certainly before the boys returned back from Japan in 1948. So they will be highlighted, and that information usually, as I mentioned, also I think in my last video, has been gleaned from either the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website or the New Zealand War Graves Project website. Normally, sometimes you'll see a date of birth on a death on the death index. Now, if I see a date of birth on a death index and I see one on a birth index, then as far as I'm concerned, I am taking it that the birth index is correct. Or indeed, if I see the date of birth or death elsewhere, again, normally my first reference point is going to be either the death index for date of death or the birth index for date of birth. That's normally the way that I've played it with these particular ones, and but I recognise that even indices can be incorrect, because if they've been incorrectly transposed from base records, then you're going to have mistakes, just as you have mistakes occurring in virtually every record that I've ever had occasion to look at, including the likes of the Cenotaph database, the nominal rolls, or what have you. So, that's just something that one has to work with and has to do the very best they can with. In the age column, again, sometimes you'll see age on a gravestone or listed in the cemetery record or listed in the death index or something like that. But as far as I'm concerned, if I have a date of birth from the birth index and a date of death from the death index, then it's a simple, then I do a manual calculation and work out just how old that person was at date of death. And that is the age that I put in that column. Obviously, if I don't have all that information, then I may fall back on one of these other sources and enter the age from there, but just so that you are aware of that. Now, I'm not going to touch on the burial and cremation columns, which we'll talk about in the next video, but I do want to just very quickly refer back to the Freedom's Core website, taking a look at menu 3, which is if you look at the top of the website, you'll see the menus there. There's the main, what you call the home page, the rolls of honour, the nominal rolls, birth, deaths, marriages, cemetery records, and knowledge repositories. Now we're going to look at the birth, deaths, marriages menu 3, and I'm just going to have a very quick quiz there. As I've said to you, a person 100 years needs to have elapsed before we can undertake a search. So you need to be very, very aware of that. I do have under that menu though a little note here. If you're looking to undertake a check of a birth, a marriage, or a death, overseas. I've got a couple of links here, one to the UK registry site, the General Register Office, and also to the free BMD index there, which has pretty much all the GRO indices dating from 1837 through to 1970. And searches can also be conducted through sites such as Find My Past and Ancestry. Just a quick point I would make that I have used the Ancestry site for some of the entries that I've run checks on, and even I think one or two that I've actually placed in the nominal roles as opposed going right back to the microfeatures again. But they are getting a little bit ragged to look at too. And also, as for Australia, the Government Information and Services Portal, there is a link there as well. I also have a little primer here for anyone if they want to understand how to undertake such a search of the birth index and zero in on the information that they're wanting, then they can do that. And all births up until or covering the period from the 1st of January 1890 through to the 30th of April 1920, that period has been covered in establishing dates of birth. I won't touch on the marriage index just yet. That's something I think I'll try and return to when I take a look at the details column. As regards death index entries, I've mentioned, why a person may not have been found, and of course, obviously, if the person's still alive, then they're going to be on the death index. But one of the reasons, as I say, could be misspelling of name. Another, obviously, would be if the person died overseas. And you may find further information also in column AK, the details column, relating to those death entries, or the information there. And the death index period that I've covered has been the 1st of January 1940. I haven't looked at any deaths prior to that date because that's more or less when the war started, roughly, as far as New Zealanders go, through to the 30th of April 2020. And again, I have a practical example that people, or a couple of practical examples people can refer to if they want to learn how to zero in and find out what a person's date of death is. So I'm hoping that with this particular video I've covered some information that is of interest to you. Tomorrow I hope to go on and we'll explore cemetery records and the like a little bit more fully. The next day we'll look at various knowledge repositories, and I want to have a good in-depth look at the details column, which is really the catch-all column. Some very, very valuable information is to be found there. And then we may, if time permits, we'll do a quick flick at one or two of the ancillary roles, looking at them in a wee bit more detail. But I want to reserve one video and solely dedicate that to the other forces role, because there's quite a bit of information that we need to go through there, and you need to learn how that is to be differentiated, from the second N.Z.E.F role. Quite different criteria have been used for the entries that you're going to find there. So thank you very much for coming along to have a look at this video. I hope I haven't bored you to death, and I look forward to returning in a day or two's time. And I hope you are making out well under COVID-19, and please stay safe, and we'll be back again talking with you soon. Thank you.